Welcome to People in Profit. I'm Stephen Carroll. My guest today has lent his expertise to the campaigns of both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in the Democratic primary in the United States, helping them to craft their propositions for a wealth tax. Gabriel Zucman is Professor of Economics at the University of California at Berkeley. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Your book, The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay, chronicles the rise and inequality of the American taxation system, but also lays out a plan for how to tackle that with a wealth tax. You're back home in France for the release of the book in French. One of the things that struck me reading this is how the American taxation system used to be very progressive, but has become much less so in quite recent times. How did that come about?
Absolutely. People have forgotten that for a long time, the US had the most progressive tax system in the world, with top marginal income tax rates for the highest earners of 80% on average from 1930 to 1980, top estate tax rates of close to 80% as well, corporate income tax rates of 50%. To realize how far the US has been in terms of tax progressivity, it's important to remember, the famous speech by FDR in Congress in 1942, where he goes to Congress and he says, "Look, I think that no American should have an income after paying taxes of more than $25,000. Therefore, I propose to create a new top marginal income tax rate of 100% above $25,000." which is the equivalent of $1 million today. And people in Congress, they hesitate a little bit, but they agree on 93%. And in the post-World War II decades, the US had 93% top tax rates. All of that changed with the Reagan, election and revolution. In 1986, the top marginal tax rate was cut to 28%, which at the time was the lowest rate among industrialized countries. And successive administrations have not changed fundamentally the Reagan-era tax system, and so that's where we are today.
And now we're in a situation where, in fact, the top earners pay a lower tax rate on average than people on low incomes.
That's what we show in the book. When you take into account all taxes paid by Americans today at all levels of government, so federal, state, local, the US tax system looks like a giant flat tax where each income group pays around 28% of their income in taxes, with one main exception, which is the billionaires, the ultra-wealthy, the top 400 richest Americans, whose tax rate in 2018, just after the Trump tax reform of 2017, was just 23%. So in 2018, for the first time over the last century, billionaires have paid a lower tax rate than working class and middle class Americans.
One of the arguments we often hear from policymakers, and we heard it from Donald Trump when he was making those tax cuts recently as well, that lower taxes means more investment and thus the economy does better. But you're saying that's not the case.
There's not a lot of evidence that this view is correct. The trickle-down theory has been tested by Reagan, with the big tax revolution of the 1980s. And, what's the outcome? From 1950 to 1980, if you look at the growth performance of the US, average income grew at a rate of 2% on average a year, and each income group saw its income increase, roughly speaking, 2% a year. Now, contrast that with what has happened since 1980, in this era of much lower tax rates on the wealthy. First of all, growth has declined a lot. It's been only 1.4% a year on average over the period 1980 to 2018. And second, and more importantly, the vast majority of the population has had much less than 1.4% income growth. For 90% of Americans, their income has grown less than that. Of course, for the very rich, income has boomed, 2%, 3%, 4% per year. But for the working class, and that's probably the most important, thing to remember, for the working class, average income for the 50% Americans in the bottom of the income distribution, the 50% poorest Americans, their income has not increased at all since 1980. Their average income was $18,000 adjusted for inflation in 1980. Today it's $18,500.
Okay, so your solution to this is a wealth tax on those richest people. How will that redress the balance?
Wealth is power. And so an extreme concentration of wealth means an extreme concentration of power. of economic power, of political power, of the power to shape ideology by buying newspapers, by creating foundations and think tanks. So if you want to have a more balanced economy and a more balanced democracy, you need to regulate wealth inequality. And the most powerful way to do that is with a progressive wealth tax on very high fortunes. So, for instance, Bernie Sanders proposes to introduce a wealth tax on net wealth above $32 million. So, if your net worth is $32 million, you pay zero, and you start paying if you have more than that, with rates that go as high as 8% above $10 billion. In the long run, it would significantly reduce the concentration of wealth and so the concentration of power in a country like the US.
And you were one of the people who were involved in crafting that Bernie Sanders proposal. How did that come about?
Yes, with my colleague Emmanuel says we helped, the Bernie Sanders and the Warren campaign design their wealth tax proposals. Basically, we've done studies over the years about the evolution of wealth concentration in the US, and so we have the data about how much wealth there really is at the top of the distribution, so we could simulate the revenue implications of various proposals, and we gave advice on, the rates and how, more importantly, how to make a wealth tax work in practice. Because, it's not for economists to say taxation should be this or that. It's for the public to decide through democratic deliberation and the vote. But where economists like us can be useful is by, helping make taxes work. If there's a political demand for more progressive taxation, how do we curb tax avoidance, tax evasion? How do we limit tax competition? How do we make progressive taxation work in the 21st century?
When you look at the two proposals, they're not identical. Do you have a preference between the two proposals that came up?
Actually, now they're pretty clear. They're pretty similar. The Warren wealth tax starts at $50 million, 1%, 2% above $50 million, and then 6% for wealth above $1 billion. The Bernie Sanders proposal starts a bit below at $32 million, at the rate of 1%, and then the rates, increase gradually all the way up to 8% above $10 billion. But they're actually relatively similar. Both of these proposals would generate a substantial amount of tax revenue, almost $4 trillion over the next 10 years, and would significantly reduce inequality in the medium run.
One of the questions people ask about the wealth tax is, if it's such a good idea, why aren't more countries doing it? France tried it, eventually withdrew it. Why do you think this plan might work?
The wealth tax that's being discussed in the US context today is very different than what was implemented in Europe for a long time in a country like France. In particular, because both the Warren and the Sanders proposals start much higher in the wealth distribution. The French wealth tax started...
There are more rich people in America, which helps.
There are more rich people, yes. The French wealth tax started at $1 million, and as I said, in the US, the wealth tax would start at $30 or $50 million. That's number one. Second difference is the context of tax competition. European countries tolerate tax competition, meaning if I'm a wealthy French person and I choose to expatriate, to move abroad to Belgium or to Switzerland, I don't have to pay taxes anymore in France. The US is different because American citizens are taxable in the US no matter where they live. And so that would make it easier for the US to implement a very progressive wealth tax going forward.
When you look at the recent fiscal policies that were implemented here in France under President Macron, he has this label of being the president of the rich. Is that something that you'd agree with?
Some of the key tax reforms of President Macron, for sure, have been a boon for the very wealthy. The abolition of the wealth tax, the introduction of a flat tax on investment income and dividends and interest, the reduction in the corporate income tax rate from 33% to 25%. So according to the studies that exist, the group of the population that's most benefited from the totality of all the tax reforms of the Macron presidency is the top 0.1% richest households who've seen an increase in their disposable income of about 4%.
Do you think the measures that were announced in response to the Gilets jaunes will help to correct that balance? Things like, taking tax off overtime hours?
No, that's taken into account, in the statistic that I was mentioning. So taking everything that's been announced since the beginning of the Macron presidency up to today, what you see is that all these reforms, they do essentially nothing for the bottom decile, so no increase in disposable income. They increase disposable income by about 2-3% for the middle class, and they increase disposable income by about 4% for the very wealthy.
Have you been contacted by any French politicians for your advice?
Yeah, no, I sometimes talk to people. I worked with a member of parliament, Boris Vallaud, to work on a better taxation of multinational companies. So yes, sometimes I talk with politicians.
Nothing from the Elysee. President Macron hasn't been calling you?
Not much.
Not much?
No.
But it has happened?
A little bit, yes, a little bit. I've been talking with advisors, from time to time.
On which subject?
On the question mostly of the taxation of multinational companies, yes. Because, there is this big question of what can we do to better tax, these big giants that shift profits to offshore tax havens. And in our book, The Triumph of Injustice, we have concrete proposals to address profit shifting to tax havens, and there's a lot of interest about these questions.
Do you think that it's a good strategy that the French government is pursuing in that area? There's the OECD plan for taxing digital currency.
I think the idea of trying to take unilateral actions, which is what France has been trying to do at some point, to tax Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, I think that idea is important. I think the way to reach an international agreement paradoxically is through unilateral actions of this kind. But the main problem with the French approach was that it was too specific, that it was only targeted to one sector of the economy, the digital industries, and it ignored the fact that profit shifting to tax havens, tax avoidance by multinational companies is an across-the-board phenomenon. It's true also for the financial industry, the pharmaceutical industry. So then it paved the way for Donald Trump to say, oh, look, France is attacking the US because it turns out that the digital industry is dominated by US companies, and so that was a problem with the French approach.
Okay, Gabriel Zucman, Professor of Economics at UC Berkeley, thank you very much for coming in to see us. Don't forget, you can get in touch with your comments on social media, but until next time, thanks for watching.
Je regarde France 24 parce qu'en tant qu'étudiante en sciences politiques, ça me permet de rester à jour sur les informations dans le monde, sur les conflits, les débats politiques, tout ça.
الاختلاف بين فرانس 24 والقنوات التانية في المحتوى المتنوع وفي التوجه الأقرب للحيادية.
I like their coverage, especially with the news and the politics, but also I like the cultural aspect because that, me as a Kenyan, I get to learn a lot about Francophone, Africa, Francophone in general, whether it's in Europe or here, just from France 24.
France 24 m'aide à voir une perspective plus complète du monde et à comprendre différentes langues et différentes cultures.
France 24, with you everywhere, all the time. Liberté, égalité, actualité.